Thank you very much, Nigel. And it's great to be here. It's a long time since I've walked across this road. I think they were still bringing coal in, actually. I came here to picket the coal yard in 1972. That's how old I am. Well, I'm a lot older than that, actually. But it's so great to hear a Vice-Chancellor speak in such a trenchant way of why we should defend art colleges. And I'm going to try and back up some of the points that Nigel has just made. And he's very luckily, he's managed to précis quite a bit of what I was going to say. You'll be very pleased to know. I mean, I was very lucky in that I managed to pass the 11 plus and go to grammar school. And from grammar school went to Hornsey College of Art, which at the time, I think there were 40 applicants for every place. People tend to forget now that only 9% of the cohort of 18 and 19-year-olds in the mid-1960s went on to higher education. Nigel intimated it the way it's expanded. It's expanded in a way that I never thought it would, ever. And I think the country's stronger for it. It was, in many ways, a very elite, paradoxically, a very elitist part of our lives, higher education. It seems extraordinary to say it now, but it's true. And as Nigel said, 45 years ago, in Crouch End, I believe it's now pronounced Cruchon, in Crouch End, we tore down the sign at the front that said Hornsey College of Art, and we very pompously but earnestly erected a sign that said the North London Centre of Creativity. And for 6 weeks it was extraordinary. Artists, designers, architects, engineers came there from all over the world. And I remember people like Buckminster Fuller turning up and people speaking for hours where we lost any sense of day or night. It just continued. Of course, being an old revolutionary, I took off in a Morris 1000 with some other students, and we tried to get the rest of Britain out on strike as well, and failed. But it was an occupation that galvanized student politics for a while, and very curious, really, because we looked anything but serious, as you can imagine, and that's got something to do with what I want to say. We were worried, as Nigel just said, we were worried that education authorities were determined to make art colleges more like mainstream centers of higher education. We saw our struggle as a political one, but not confined by the nature of British party politics. We were trying to tell our contemporaries that art colleges, self-evidently, were at the pointed end of the great surge of creativity and imagination that appeared to be dragging Britain and the British economy and society away from the sparse grey decades that had followed the world wars. The product of our art school was a revived willingness to understand that great science is impossible without great design, that without understanding the yearning within most of us for visual beauty, elegance, sensation, wit, and sensitivity, we'll create buildings, cities, tools, furniture, factories, hospitals that impoverish us by draining our humanity and aspirations, our concerns for each other, and our need to challenge and to be challenged. So, as Nigel intimated, you might ask, how does an art student from swinging London in the 1960s end up overseeing MI5, MI6, and GCHQ? Well, it can be explained in no small part to having been the recipient of an art school education in the first place. I know of no other form of higher education that offered the opportunity to learn such a range of skills in such a challenging way. At Hornsey, between 1965 and 1969, I learned to paint, sculpt, print, weld, organize concepts and ideas and express them visually and orally, as well as on the written page. I learned art history, architecture, photography and film, as well as the science of spatial relationships, some of which were taught to us by artists like Bridget Riley. I learned about the centrality of good design in creating and sustaining successful businesses, economies, and societies. I learned that without good design, it is impossible for a developed country to compete in an increasingly globalized economy. To this day, I can't think of an institution of learning that offered such a range of stimulus and expertise. 3 highly eventful and sometimes dangerous decades passed before I was able to think about applying the skills I'd acquired at art school to government. But I want to tell you about 2 exercises that we carried out in the first years after the election of Tony Blair's first government in May 1997. Both were designed to explore how we might understand better the dynamics of the British economy and how other economies and societies regarded us. Prime Minister Blair's first Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Chris Smith, now with the wonderful title of Baron Smith of Finsbury. Baron Smith of Finsbury. He set up the Creative Industries Task Force. They used to call everything task forces then, but this was the Creative Industries Task Force. And the idea was to try and map out, as it was put, what contribution the creative industries were making to our economy. And it was a huge task involving designers like Paul Smith and entrepreneurs like Richard Branson. And I was lucky enough, I was an education minister at the time, to be a member of that task force. And like all of its other members, I was astounded when we began accumulating facts and calculating the revenue generated by the creative industries. We looked at more or less everything, from high opera and wallpaper design through dance, drama, and television, to fashion, computer-aided design and fine art, from pop music, film studios and post-production, to car design and computer games. Very early, it became obvious that these myriad creative industries were generating huge amounts of money for this country. Taken as a sector, they certainly ranked among our 5 largest earners of foreign currency. I remember, as Nigel pointed out, this was 1997, way before the really massive growth of so much of our online economy, which itself, of course, owes so much to the creative industries. The work of the Creative Industries Task Force was proof, if anyone needed it, that our art schools, our music academies, drama schools, dance schools, institutes of architecture, and film schools were contributing hugely to our economy and society and to our worldwide reputation as a creative nation. Now, our second exercise served to prove that the contribution of these schools and academies was not only food for the soul and profitable for the nation, but that without their contribution, we as a nation would fail to keep up with the competition in the world's most dynamic sectors, namely internet-based communications and economies. We began a series of investigations into what made Silicon Valley such a massive revolutionary success. We tried unpicking the variables of the equation, if I may put it like that, of what constituted Silicon Valley. What was it that was in place in Central California that fed this extraordinary beast? Was it a concentration of scientists, mathematicians, and engineers who understood the implications and potential of digitization better than anyone else in the world? Was it the tax regime that helped nurse tiny companies to blossom into huge dot-com enterprises? Was it the combination of terrific roads, fast food outlets, excellent local airports, superb universities? Was it the plentiful supply of sharp commercial lawyers who understood the value of intellectual property? Well, it was all of these. Plus, crucially, the artists, designers, musicians, composers, writers, photographers, and dramatists who contributed centrally or marginally to virtually all of the products that emerged from Silicon Valley and from its most innovatory offspring around the world. Which were the most important of the variables, alongside a market hungry for faster and more versatile means of communication and entertainment? Well, we never managed to identify which were the most important. I was part of endless arguments about whether lawyers were more important than mathematicians, graphic designers more than authors, program designers more than engineers, bankers more than musicians. I don't think there's any question about bankers now. The fact is, however, its phenomenal success was due to all of these talents, skills, machines, roads, airports, and aspirations being available at the same time when needed, either physically or in the same place or electronically via the ether. Quite frankly, it is madness for any government to argue that we don't need the very best centers of education that teach subjects beyond a narrow mainstream, itself a spurious concept, by the way, of so-called academic subjects. I'm afraid it was a mistake that Labour government ministers made. I worked with lots of them, as well as a mistake that's being made by a Tory and Liberal coalition government. The obsession with paper qualifications, the rigidity of the curriculum in our secondary schools, the idiotic idea that somehow your status is higher if you study law or physics or classical Greek than if you study art or dance or drama. I'm sure the Renaissance produced lots of lawyers, but it's not the lawyers we remember. It's the artists, the architects, the explorers, the composers, and the writers. And it's true of almost any age, from prehistoric paintings on our cave walls to Damien Hirst on desert island discs. I'm afraid that a great many politicians and administrators, newspaper editors, and educational opinion formers find this extremely difficult to understand. It's partly, of course, because they arrived in their exalted positions via a relatively narrow mainstream. Politics and government always are about having to decide how to distribute limited resources, taxpayers' money. If those responsible for those decisions have no notion of what goes on in art schools or why art schools matter, then no one can be surprised when during financial recessions, narrow-minded and destructive decisions are made. You are fighting for much more than the provision of what adequate funding for art schools should be. Without art schools, and all of the other higher education institutions that teach creative disciplines, our excellent mainstream university provision will not be able to draw on a massive creative potential that could give this country the competitive edge in the production of intellectual property and in the design of worlds and societies yet to be conceived. Thank you very much.